Hi, everybody. Glad you're here. This is Rob Darrow with ED 615 at CSU Monterey Bay, October 15th, 2020. We're glad you're all here to have this great conversation talking about race, privilege, gender, and sexual orientation in the K-8 history classroom. I'm happy to say that the panel members here, some of them I've known for more than 40 years, and some of them I've known for less than 40 years. But as I've gotten to know each one of them in new ways, when we had conversations about race or privilege or gender or sexual orientation, I learned more about who they were and their stories. So I'm excited that you're all here today to hear their stories. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to my Zoom screen. And so I'm going to start by, so the first question for everybody is, just to share a little bit about yourself, your story, and your identity. And if you noticed on that slide, I included identity for each person because in this class, everybody's been assigned to follow a culture and to pay attention to culture throughout this class in addition to other things. So with that, Tyler, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Rob, for having me and inviting me to speak with your class. I'll just start off by saying how humbled I am to be able to share a little bit of my experience with some future teachers, or seems to be kind of already practicing teachers in the field. So I'm really excited for your future, and hopefully you can take a little bit away from what I share with you. So again, my name is Tyler Williamson. I am a council member within the city of Monterey. I was elected to the city council in 2018. And I go by he, him, his pronouns. I identify as Black. I am also part of the queer community. I am gay. And yeah, so that's a little bit of an intro. I guess I'll also share that. So city council is supposed to be a part-time thing. How the state has created how we get paid for city council, which is nothing. I get $400 a month, is based off of your population. And so if I was in a larger city like San Francisco or LA, it would be a full-time job. In Monterey, it's supposed to be a part-time thing. So I have a full-time job. I work at the Naval Postgraduate School. I am the admin officer for the IT department. So that's my day job. It keeps me busy, but so does city council and being involved in the community. And as you might see from the flyer, another thing I do in my life, not that I don't do enough, is I am one of the co-chairs and the founder of Monterey Peninsula Pride, which was founded in 2017. And we've been hosting a Pride every year since, including this past year. We did a joint virtual Pride with Santa Cruz Pride, Pajaro Valley Pride, which is basically Watsonville area, Monterey Peninsula Pride, and Salinas Pride. So really exciting opportunities happening. And obviously, as you can tell by what I've shared with you so far, I like to be involved and engaged in the community and just try to find a way of being some added value towards life and enjoying this beautiful thing that we call life. So, but about my story, yeah, so my mom served in the Navy for 20 years. So I was born in a naval hospital in Patuxent River, Maryland, and we moved around a lot. I've never lived anywhere for more than 4 years my entire life until I moved to Monterey in 2010. So I've been here for about a decade now. And so, yeah, my mom is a little bit more fair-skinned. My dad is Black. If you see my dad, he's Black. But my mom, you kind of asked that question, and Rob, you put this in an email that you sent to us, being asked the question, "Where are you from?" My mom has gotten that a lot. I've gotten that a lot because if you can tell, maybe I'm not fully Black, and so there's definitely an experience there. But my mom being in the military, I moved around a lot. I was in a lot of schools that were very diverse. Actually, I was in a lot of schools that were predominantly of a white population. So I never grew up in a community like my cousins and distant relatives that I have, where it's an all Black community. So it's been hard for me to relate to a certain extent growing up as a Black person, because I don't have that culture aspect of the African American community, where what you see in a lot of what's happening in media today, you know, policing communities of color at a disproportionate rate, right? I never really had to deal with that, but I have related in a lot of ways because I have been pulled over by cops several times, and I have had people cross the street when I'm walking. Now, albeit that could be because of my gender as well, but the point being is that I've had a lot of experiences of racism in my own upbringing, simply because of the color of my skin. So although I didn't grow up in a Black community, I still had to experience that. And also growing up in schools that were mostly white, there was a lot of subliminal things that happened that at the time I never really thought much about. But now that I'm educated and have had some life experiences, and have developed relationships with wonderful people that have told me, no, that's wrong. It's made me realize and reflect on a lot of these experiences that I'm still trying to piece apart, the effect that those have had on me. And so I'll stop here for a second and just kind of say how I think important of a point this is in regards to what your career is going to be like, right? And the impact that you're going to have on youth. Because it was those experiences in the classroom and interacting with my classmates, and teachers that had an impact on how I saw myself and how comfortable I was with who I am. So that being said, I finished grade school, went off to college. I, again, moved to Monterey in 2010. And if I could for a second back up for a second, there's a story here. I never was really involved in politics before. And it was 2008 timeframe. Obama was running. I see this guy kind of on TV. He kind of looks like me and very inspirational. He is, I'll tell you, he's one of my life heroes. Just super inspiring human being. And he was the reason why I got involved in politics. Him and I had a faculty member. I was taking an English class, critical thinking class in community college. And just the way that she made us think about the world too, just kind of happened to all work out at the same time. So I got involved with Obama's campaign, but I was working 2 jobs. I was going to school. I just wasn't able to get involved as much as I wanted to. So I told myself in 2012, I'm going to sign up. I'm going to get more involved in Obama's campaign next go around. So 2012 came around, and it was April of 2012. I applied for his fellowship program on his campaign website. I got accepted into that, went up to Hayward, went to like a week-long training, and they tell us all to go back to our communities and join a neighborhood team to be in a leadership role. Well, in Monterey, they didn't have any team at all in the entire county. And so they said, we want you to go back and create a team. So I was like, okay. So they had the tools created for me, and it was relatively easy. I used the tools. I posted events and tried to draw people out. People came out in droves. And I think people were just really waiting for somebody from the campaign to get something started. But immediately it drew crowds. And 3 weeks into that fellowship program, the campaign asked me to be on their staff. And at first I said no, which is a whole nother story. But I eventually said yes. They basically had me responsible for the city of San Francisco. So up to this point in my life, I am not out. And I'm even struggling to be out to myself, which is a whole nother layer of coming outness. So I go up to San Francisco, and at first I'm in Oakland, and I'm getting trained there for the first week or two. And then they were literally, I worked with them on finding the campaign office. They had the majority rule. They wanted it to be in the Castro. So, and I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, oh, great. Like, this is going to be horrible. And so I go over, I get to, I'm getting furniture. I'm getting the office ready to go. I'm getting volunteers. And I have my own fellows now at this point. And one of my fellows took me out bowling one night. And and that's where I met my first male partner. It was his friend, and it forever changed my life meeting him, and love him dearly. And it was funny. I'll back up and tell you one more story. When we got the office, I remember standing in it when there was no furniture, and they're just these ceiling to floor windows, and I'm just seeing like these beautiful men walking by, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. But this is like me kind of transitioning and trying to figure out like what it means to be comfortable. And so it was that intern that I had, and one of my other volunteers that joined the campaign, that really helped me come out. And if you can imagine, the people in San Francisco are a lot more fluffy and we're just wonderful people. And so they were just super gracious and kind, and just really kind of gave me some therapy to kind of, for me to be more comfortable in my skin and who I was. So I was in a wonderful environment. But at this point in my life, I was 27-ish, somewhere around there. So, you know, not too far along. I'm 33 now. So it's, you know, it wasn't that long ago that this happened. And then the campaign was over. So I took a leave of absence from school and work. I was working my full-time job at MPS. I was going to CSUMB to get my undergrad. And so I took a leave of absence from both to go work on the campaign, which is why I said no before. And so at the end of the campaign, I had to go back to come back down to Monterey. And so I'm thinking, like, how am I going to do this? I need to tell my family. And so I planned the trip, and I called my mom. And of course, I just came out to my mom over the phone because it's my mom, and she was just a lot more comfortable with it than the rest of my family would be, particularly my father. And so my mom's like, oh yeah, I love you. You're my baby. Of course, it's what I expected. And so I drove down with my then boyfriend to Monterey. He sat in the car while I went inside, and I pulled my mom and my dad into their bedroom and broke the news to my dad. And side note, my dad, very abusive growing up, a lot of beatings. And so I was scared shitless. Can I say that in the class? I was scared shitless. It was probably one of the scariest moments of my life to do that. But I just felt like I had to do it for myself. And
Right.
And so I told him, and his response was, it's okay, I accept you for you are. And I was like, what the heck? Like, to hear what I just described my dad, and then how he responded, it was just completely different than what I expected. And he kept talking to me, and then towards the end of the conversation, went on for a little bit, but towards the end of the conversation, he goes, I just hope one day that you can accept Jesus Christ into your life. But you know what, though? Honestly, if that's the worst that he said, I was cool with that. I was so okay with the way that he responded. And so, and then he also said, I just don't ever want to see you with the man. So that was kind of hard too, because I was like, well, how am I going to bring the person I love in my life around my family? But again, at least he wasn't like choking me out. So I was cool. And so afterwards, I went to the car to get him, and I told my brothers to meet me in the garage because I wanted to introduce him, my then boyfriend, to my brothers, and try to avoid my dad. So we're in the garage. I'm introducing them. And then the door opens to the garage, and my dad walks in, and it was just kind of like an awkward moment. My dad came up, he shook his hand. My dad was collegial about it. Well, we go home back up to San Francisco that night, and come to find out the next day for my mom, my dad had a panic attack overnight, so it was really difficult. Then there was this experience where I was graduating from CSUMB, and without sharing the whole story, when my dad came out and pulled a knife, when my partner was there, it was just really, really crazy. Now that I'm with a new partner, my dad has accepted him, and he loves him, and we're in a better space now. It just took some time. It took some time for him to be okay with that. And I'll end with, because I know I'm probably going a little over time here, but I'll end with kind of experiences. There's so much to say that I had with my intersectionality. So, and I'm not sure if you guys have had too much conversation about intersectionality, but just to kind of give a quick definition of that, it's when you have two or more things that cause you to be discriminated against. And so for me, my intersectionality is the fact that I'm gay and the fact that I'm Black. And when you have an intersectionality, it's a layered discriminatory experience. And so I definitely deal with that a lot. And as you can imagine, the city of Monterey is, I think, somewhere around 78% white. I was the first Black person to ever be elected as city council in Monterey. I was the first queer person to ever be elected, openly queer person to ever be elected to the Monterey City Council. So there's a lot of firsts, and I was the youngest too, right? But there, the Black and the queer thing, I think, was very challenging for some folks, and I still think I get some resistance to that experience now. And when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, particularly after the shooting and the murder of George Floyd, John Wizard, who was a council member in the city of Seaside, and I hosted the first demonstration in the county at Window on the Bay, which is that kind of open space when you're driving by on Del Monte in Monterey towards the tunnel. And so we held that demonstration there, and when we were planning it, we wanted to make sure that we were really intentional about having an outcome and not just have people get together just to get together. And so we really wanted to focus on the idea of defunding the police. And so we spoke about that, and that was kind of like our call to arms for everybody to get civically engaged, show up to council meetings. We were, if you imagine, we're in the middle of a pandemic and our budgets are all taking an effect from the loss of income being generated. And so I'll give you an example. In the city of Monterey, the police department's budget was only cut 4%, but the library and the sports center and museums, they were all cut upwards of like 60%. So there was some inequity there. And my point was, we just need to make that a little bit more equitable, so that we can make sure we're providing services that are more proactive as opposed to reactive. So anyways, I kind of made my point during the speech, and I'll tell you, the response from that was one of the most challenging moments, not just of council, but probably of my entire life. Just kind of the feedback that I received and some of the hate that I received from the community and people thinking I'm crazy, as opposed to just like trying to find out where I'm coming from as a Black person experiencing these challenges. So that's kind of I think part of that intersectionality experience that I've had. Now I'll stop there to let others
Great.
speak.
Tyler, thanks for hitting all those pieces and sharing a piece of your life with us. And we'll revisit some of those, I'm sure, in a little bit. But let's move on to Blanca.
Thank you, Rob. Happy to be here with your class this afternoon. I know what you mean, Tyler, when Rob said, try and share part of your story in 5 minutes. I was like, whoa, I have a lot of things to say, but I'm going to try. And I will start by saying that I am an immigrant to this country. I came to this country when I was 3 years old, undocumented. My parents were teenagers when they had me. And so I ended up moving to Watsonville, California, which is where my grandfather was located because he was part of the Bracero program. And so this is where he had kind of established his residency. So when I began school, I actually had a different identity. I had a completely different name. My parents were afraid that they would find out that we were undocumented. So the first couple of years of my schooling, I went by the name of Anna. And it wasn't until I moved schools that I knew that wasn't really my name. Like, I don't know how I was able to pull it off and this dual identity. My mom says I was just really clever, but I did. I knew who to tell that my name was Blanca, and I knew who to tell that my name was Anna. And so talk about conflicting identity. So my primary language is Spanish. I went to school speaking Spanish only. You can't tell on the camera, but I'm actually, darker rather than lighter. And so the fact that my name was Blanca, I got teased a lot in school because people that were Spanish, bilingual or Spanish speaking, would say, why is your name white? You're not white, And so it was really hurtful. It got to the point where I think maybe second grade, I came home crying to my mom, and my family, my grandmother especially, very devout Catholics. And so my mom actually walked me over to a church that was nearby where we lived in Pajaro. And she took me to the statue where the Virgin Mary was. And she said, look at the color of her skin. She's like, you have the color of the skin of a queen, you know, of the mother of God. And so there's nothing to be ashamed of. You know, your skin is beautiful. And that was so important at that moment in my life, because I was kind of like, yeah, that's right. My color, I have the color of the, you know, of like this super important person, you know, in my family's life. So, but that was kind of a hard experience. And the other was obviously not even understanding English. My own cousins who were born here would tease me when I was trying to learn English. And so that was kind of another issue that I kind of grew up with. Obviously grew up in poverty. You know, my family, we rented a one bedroom in a household for a long time. We didn't really have our own space, didn't really, even our own, you know, food that we would purchase. The other people would get into it, but then if I would get into their food, they would make a big scandal. So it was, I didn't realize it because I was younger, you know, this is like my elementary school years, but as I have reflected growing up, you know, it must have been so difficult for my parents, you know. So the other thing I want to share with you is that when I was, up until I was in fourth grade, I was always considered a kind of a chatterbox, according to my teachers. That's what all my progress reports say. Blanca's a little chatterbox. Well, in fourth grade, I had my first Latina teacher. She was a first-year teacher, Miss Valdez. And she actually asked me, like, why do you talk so much? Like, why are you distracted? And I said, because I'm done. This is too easy for me. And so she took it upon herself to learn a little bit more about my learning and realized that it was easy for me and I was getting my work done. So therefore I was done and I just thought it was social time. And so she kind of changed the trajectory of my education. And I give her a lot of credit for that, because all of a sudden I went from being a chatterbox in her class to like this gifted student. And I remember bringing this application for my parents and they're like, what is this? So I had to like interpret what it was and they just signed off on it. But it was like that was so key, because I can imagine if that kept, you know, being my reputation as teachers kept reading my CUME file, right? It's just a different perception. So I think that's really important, and I wanted to share that story, given that, you know, the individuals in this class are K-8 teachers, or are going to be, how important it is to kind of pause sometimes and ask why, you know, certain behaviors are being exhibited. In fifth grade, I was part of a deportation hearing. My father was going to be deported, and of course, all of us were also. And I remember being on the stand having to answer questions, and I answered everything. I had to interpret for my parents because the lawyer was not bilingual and nobody in the courthouse was bilingual. And that's kind of surprising, right? I mean, I can't even imagine that. But I remember having to sit there and interpret between the lawyer, my parents, and the judge. I mean, it was just this weird moment. And the judge ended up not deporting us because I had a brother who was born here. And he also felt like, since all of my education was here and what I had expressed, and he was very impressed with just my knowledge and my abilities, and he decided to give us another chance. So we went through this whole other process. But so I say that, and I will close. I have so much more to say, but I wanted to share those because those are two very important ones in my earlier years. And I'll end with saying that I'm currently the Associate Superintendent of Instructional Services for the Salinas Union High School District. I'm also the mother of two boys, a 13-year-old who's a freshman, a 10-year-old who's a fifth grader. So balancing being a mom and an associate superintendent. I'm the oldest of four children, and I identify as a Latina. My pronouns are her, she, and ella. And I am just I would also identify as a social justice activist who really cares about uplifting others in the community and really thinking about ways to not only engage in the educational system, to kind of dismantle some of the inequities that exist because of policies that have been in place for hundreds of years, but also in the community and how we can change things within the community. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Great, thanks, Blanca. That was wonderful. Glenn, you're up next.
All right. As Rob, or I guess Dr. Darrow, I need to say Dr. Darrow.
Yeah, right.
In case you haven't noticed, he mentioned it at the outset that there's a panelist that he's known for over 40 years. In case you haven't guessed, I am the one who's over 40 years. We've known each other since college, so if I call him Rob, you'll have to excuse me. So I just wanted to applaud all of you for being here as future educators. I'm 64 years old and married to an educator who was in education for 36 years. She taught special education, kindergarten, second grade, and third grade. So right in the area that you guys are focusing on right now, at least in your class. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from UC Riverside, where I first met Dr. Darrow. I also have a master's degree in business from UCLA. I retired in 2016. I've been trying to encourage Dr. Darrow to retire, but he's too busy teaching all the future teachers, which I'm glad that he's doing. I retired after 36 years in financial planning and analysis, 26 years in the corporate world, and my final 6 years were in financial planning at higher education at UCLA. Since this is a discussion group about history, I thought I would share some of my family history. And since I'm old, my family history is a lot older than the other panelists. So I'm a third generation American of Japanese descent. So in the Japanese world or Japanese American world, they call that a sansei. So I'm a sansei, third generation American from Japan. My parents, my paternal grandparents and my maternal grandparents are first generation. They're the ones who emigrated from Japan. So they were called the Issei. And my parents are the second generation. They are the Sansei. So both my parents were born in the United States, so they're born US citizens. A little bit of the history that I never learned about in history books, but had to learn through family history, was during World War II, there was a Presidential Executive Order 9066, which was written by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. My parents and grandparents were forced to leave Los Angeles, where they were born, and were sent to prison camps, which euphemistically they called internment camps or relocation centers, solely because of their ancestry. My father's family was sent to Jerome, Arkansas from Los Angeles. My mother's family was sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming in the dead of winter. My parents and their siblings were all American-born citizens. My father was 19 when he was sent off to the camps, and my mother was 17. 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry were sent to the internment camps. Over 60% were US citizens. My grandparents were not US citizens at the time because it was illegal for them to gain citizenship. Later, they did become naturalized citizens when the laws were changed. My mother graduated from high school while at Heart Mountain Internment Camp. So in the middle of her high school years, she had to leave her home and was sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And there she graduated as the valedictorian of her high school class. My father volunteered and served in the U.S. Army during World War II at the same time that his family was being held in the internment camps behind barbed wire. He was an officer in the Military Intelligence Service and served under General MacArthur. In the post-war era, he served as the interpreter for the war crimes trials held in Tokyo, Japan. Rob asked me to share with you a little bit about my experience that I had when I actually visited one of the internment camps. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to do that now. A year ago, as I was traveling across the country, as my wife and I were headed off to take my son to Silver Spring, Maryland, where he was relocating. On the way, we stopped at Heart Mountain, Wyoming, internment camp where my mother's family was sent. There's now a very, very nice visitor center on site. And as I entered the visitor center, the docent asked me if anyone in my family had been at the Heart Mountain Internment Center. And of course I said yes. So as I toured the center, the docent was off gathering some information for me. While in this visitor center, I was walking around carefully looking at all the pictures on the walls, looking to see if I could see a picture of my mother. And much to my surprise, as I came around the corner of leaving one of the rooms and entering another, I saw a very large picture on the wall of the Heart Mountain Photography Club. And kneeling in the front row was a picture of my grandfather. It was quite a moving experience for me. So what was interesting is I stood there and I told my wife and my son, hey, that's my grandfather kneeling in the front row. A woman overheard us and said, that's your grandfather? I go, yeah, that's my grandfather. She goes, well, did you know him? I go, absolutely. He used to come over to my house all the time. I used to go to his house all the time. I think it was rather surprising to me that perhaps she felt that this was so long ago, that this was ancient history, but I think she was surprised to find out that someone my age would actually know someone who was sent to those internment camps. So while we were touring the visitor center, the docent pulled some government records of my mother's family, that showed when they arrived, the specific location of the multifamily barrack where they lived, their government assigned numbers. So they had numbers assigned to them as if they were prisoners, because they were. Documents also showed when they departed and where they went when they departed, because they were not allowed to immediately return to their home in Los Angeles. They had to relocate. In order to leave the centers, the internment camps, they had to find sponsors where they could live off of the West Coast. So the docent also gave me an aerial picture, an aerial map of the location right now. Superimposed on that was the location of the barracks where my mother's family lived. So I had the opportunity to drive down a dirt road and walk out and stand right in the place where that barrack would have been. Sorry.
That's all right.
It was a tremendously moving experience for me. To imagine what it would have been like to be there in the dead of winter, being relocated from Los Angeles, given only a few days to pack anything that you could carry, and be put behind barbed wire with armed guards guarding you there. Losing their personal freedom for no other reason than the fact that they looked like the enemy and they had ancestors from Japan. This was a really, really, really important part of my family history. And I believe it's an important part of American history that, at least in my education, was never, ever mentioned. The only reason that I know about this, and my parents didn't talk about it very much, because this was a shameful thing for their generation and their parents' generation to be actually put in prison. So they didn't talk about it much, but I learned about it because I attended, since since birth, I attend a Japanese American church in downtown Los Angeles, and that's a community where these stories get shared. So this is something that, at least I don't know about modern day history classes if this kind of thing is taught, but I think it's important for us to mention these kinds of things, especially in an era where racial discrimination is quite a problem. That things that the political environment that existed in the 1940s that put my parents and my parents' families in prison camps, that things have not changed significantly enough that this could happen again. And if we don't, as the saying goes, if you don't learn about history, you're destined to repeat it. So I identify as he and him. This is a new thing for me to say because I'm 64 years old. I grew up in primarily white communities. I think in my high school there were probably only 5 Asians in the entire school. My college career was with Rob, primarily white folks there. My working environment is primarily white people. And in these days and times of Black Lives Matter, I am personally working to try and understand better about racism in America and the history of how we got to where we are today. Even though I'm retired, I'm still trying to learn at the urging of my son, who is a master's degree in social work candidate right now. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Glenn. Wow. So just, so Glenn and I have been friends for years, and we never even talked about this aspect of his life until like 20 years ago. And so it really got me thinking, along with everything else going on right now, how he was treated differently than me, but I didn't realize it at the time during college and that sort of thing. So thanks, Glenn. Aisha, are you there?
I am.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. There's my other friend, Aisha.
How are you, Rob? Thank you so much for having me.
Glad you're here. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to the other panelists for sharing your stories. They're really moving. And you definitely were tugging on my heartstrings so much. Thank you for sharing all the ways that you've been affected in your lives. I appreciate it. My name is Erica Aisha Sharves. I usually go by my Muslim name, Aisha. My last name is actually Chavez with an R, but when my family immigrated here, they worked really hard on being super white. So they added an R to our last name and pronounced it French. So my family says our last name Sharves instead of Chavez. So yeah. And it took me until I moved to California to figure all of that out. I had people where I grew up that knew I was Latinx, but I was not aware of that fact because it's not something that my family really talks about. I grew up between California and Idaho. My mom and her family are evangelicals who live in super northern Idaho, just a stone's throw away from Canada. And I have 2 dads because when I was in elementary school, my dad came out. His family is from California. So he moved back down to California and met my other dad, and they've been together since I was in elementary school, which was not common in the 90s. And it really felt like I was living 2 different lives, in fact, because I would come into California and stay and live with my dads, and then I would go back up to Idaho, and they'd ask you, like, what did you do for your summer vacation? And I would tell them that I hung out above a gay bar and that Chocolate Fantasy, the drag queen, borrowed my bra. It wasn't really, I felt for a long time that people didn't really understand that, and I was sort of an outcast at school. In the 90s, it was not really popular to be gay. A lot of people in my school totally were paranoid that I probably had AIDS because of my father, and a lot of other things, I think, like that. My best friend and I became best friends after, so in my early years, I actually went to evangelical school, but I did not fit in there, and I got in a lot of disagreements. So I was finally allowed to go to public school, and that was where I met my best friend, who was also standing up for a queer student on the bus. And that is how we became best friends, because she also liked to fight racists and bigots, which was really kind of like my hobby most of my life until now. So I'll keep carrying that on. My two dads are wonderful people. They taught me, in fact, growing up in the queer community taught me so much about loving myself no matter what other people said, loving myself where I was, loving myself and thinking I was beautiful or wonderful or amazing, even if other people didn't say that. Like, it made a huge difference actually in my life. And I think, so I actually converted to Islam when I was in my late teens through, to make a long story very short, through debating friends, because again, I grew up evangelical, so they really taught us to debate our side. And I debated my friends who were Muslim and found out that my beliefs aligned with theirs better. I was way more worried to tell my family that I was Muslim than I was to tell them I was queer. It was right after September 11th. No, actually it was right before, I'm sorry. It was right before September 11th and right after we sort of had a lot more family conflict over that fact, but my family are at least well-meaning people. So I was never like thrown out of my family. They never told me to like not come back. And just this last year, I was up in Idaho for Eid because no one was doing anything for any holidays. Thank you, COVID. And I actually chose to stay there for Eid, which was the weirdest thing in my entire life. I would have never thought that my family could have come around to congratulating me and to telling me happy Eid, to look up how do Muslims generally say happy Eid. I was really shocked. So thankfully, when I was younger, it was really difficult, but now it's a lot easier. And I do want to mention, since you all are teaching younger kids, that there's a lot of really interesting statistics from CARE, the Center for American Islamic Relations, on bullying that Muslim students face. I also teach Sunday school at my local masjid. It surprises me that they let me do that when I'm also, like, most of my side gigs are working with the queer community, but our small mosque, or masjid as we call them, is really nice and open and affirming as much as they can be. But our students here also face discrimination, and they are regularly bullied in schools, even in Santa Cruz County, just like that happens to non-binary kids in school here and trans kids in school here. We sometimes think because we live in a place like California or Santa Cruz or Monterey that does not happen here. And strangely, the only times I've ever been harassed for wearing my hijab or assaulted for wearing my hijab are in Santa Cruz and Portland, Oregon. Not in Moscow, Idaho, not in Kalispell, Montana, where my best friend lives, like here. And we often seem to think that's when your teachers, do remember to look out for all of your students and their multiple identities. I think that 70%, according to a CARE study, 70% of students say that they feel welcome at school. 30% of students say that they do not feel comfortable telling people that they're Muslim at school. So I don't know what that's like. I would like to have kids someday, inshallah. And I hope that their teachers look out for them and at least include something in their history lesson that's really positive towards Muslims. It took until I had been Muslim for years and met my spouse, and we lived abroad in Abu Dhabi. That was the first time I found out about Ibn Sina, who was like one of the most amazing people in history about both astrology, medicine, who, by the way, is usually called by his European name instead of his Arab name. Like, there's so many great things that happen in Muslim and Arab history, and I learned zero of them going to school. None. So I do think that that's one of the best ways that you can help your students. Growing up in a queer family, I never saw my family represented in anything. It wasn't until I came to California that I finally even saw recognition of non-traditional families. you know, and they'd usually just like give the example of raised by your grandparents or your auntie or something like that. I don't even think I saw, other than in really very gay spaces. One of my dads worked at a gay bar, and for a while we lived above one. So that's how I got to hang out with Chocolate Fantasy and all the drag queens when they were getting ready. And it took a really long time for me to see my family and people that I love represented in the world. And still to this day, whenever I see queer people kiss on TV or anywhere else, my heart swells with happiness just to even see that represented in the world as a thing that exists. I've been involved in Muslim leadership ever since I went to college up at Portland State University. I started studying Arabic because as a liberal feminist, I believe that Islam is feminist and has room for all of those things, but that's not everyone's view. So I really wanted to study Arabic so that I could make a better argument for myself. And I got a Fulbright when I graduated. I moved to Abu Dhabi to research Emirati women's leadership and social change there, which is where I met my spouse. I've lived in Cairo for a couple years and then back to Abu Dhabi, and now we live here. My spouse is an immigrant. We got married on a party boat on the Nile, which I highly recommend if anyone's for a party spot. And I just want to mention that much like Blanca, when I was young, I was talkative. And when I was young, I was a leader. And it was really my teacher's reaction to that really changed that. At evangelical school, I was always told to be quiet. If I questioned my teachers, I was put in the hallway. If I questioned their teachings, I was put in the hallway. Like, it was okay to hit kids in school where I went to school. So that my parents wouldn't hit me, but that is definitely an experience I had at school until my dad refused to sign the form for it the next year. So I think that how you choose to teach really shapes people's lives. It took me years to realize that it's okay to be talkative and friendly and outgoing, like maybe not while the teacher's talking, but I really appreciate the teachers I had later in life who encouraged me and supported me in those things, because it really changed me when people at school would treat me that way as opposed to my peers. The end. Unlike you all, I don't have these awesome big long stories. I don't know.
Those are wonderful, awesome big long stories. So Isha kind of talked about whether she saw herself in the curriculum or not growing up. So I'm curious from the rest of you, what do you recall seeing or not seeing yourself in the curriculum in a history class? Do you recall having that experience at some point in schooling? And when did that happen? And what was your reaction at that point? Anybody can jump in.
I'll just quickly say, no, I did not see myself in the curriculum. And it wasn't until I was at the community college where I saw myself in the curriculum. And so that is why in our district, we now have ethnic studies as a graduation requirement.
I think, as I said, and I went to school back in the Stone Age, so history classes.
I don't know how you went in the Stone Age and I didn't.
Used to ride my dinosaur to school, but the Japanese American experience was never represented at all in any history class, or at least if I wasn't paying attention, maybe it was, but it was never represented. The experience of Japanese Americans during World War II. Never learned about internment camps, never learned about the most decorated army unit that was comprised of fully Japanese Americans during World War II, of which many of those members of that 442nd Infantry 100th Battalion were members at my church. So I knew many of them, but they took on a lot of casualties during World War I and were given some of the most dangerous missions because I'm assuming they were considered to be expendable during the wartime.
Yeah, I would just say, excuse me, I would say it's kind of like both the Black and the queer communities that I relate to, and I agree with Blanca, but I think it's we are reflected in history, but it's not in the way that is right or accurate assessment of what really happened in history, right? So we can think back to the foundings of the country. You know, I think about my African American side and how Black people are still going through slavery, talking about like indentured servitude, and now we look at the prison industrial complex, and how we see people of color being arrested and put in prison at disproportionate rates still today. And then, you know, I think of the queer side, and how when I think about the history books of what we were learning about in school, it was really just really focused on the AIDS and it was, you know, epidemic, and just kind of like a touch point, and it kind of made you almost more scared of it as opposed to recognizing the beauty. I love how Aisha described the queer community. I have that same feeling, right? And there's so much love in the community, but it wasn't described like that in the history book. So very much misrepresented.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts on that? Any questions from anybody else along those lines? Because I think we're going to move into this next phase, which is, so what do we do about that in school and that sort of thing? But I want to see if there's any class members that want to jump in or ask anything about anything that anybody's said up to this point. Okay, I know that you'll let us know in the chat if you do.
I just want to say thank you for all of you for sharing your stories. I think that is very, very brave, and I think we all, I know we all very much appreciate you all being here and sharing this with you, and it really means a lot to us.
I agree with what Taylor said. I really appreciate your stories. Aisha, I understand what, no, it wasn't Aisha, I'm sorry. It was, I think it was Blanca. She was talking about, both of you. You're talking about how it was hard for you to really accept the, oh, sorry, 1 second.
I'm realizing it's easier if you show your faces when you talk, so thanks for doing that.
Sorry. I really appreciate you sharing your stories, because you talked about how it was hard for you to really accept the color type, the person of color that you were. And I struggled with that a lot when I was growing up. Like I grew up in just like Tyler as well. I grew up in mostly white community. And so, and like my cousins and everything, they grew up in more urban communities. And so I never really understood like who I really was until I got to college. Like it took me until I got to college to really accept that I was Black and that I should be loud and be Black and be proud about who I am. So I resonated really well with all your stories. So thank you for sharing.
If I could just respond to your comments there, Cara, I think it's really relevant, right? Because we see this conflict within the African American community, right? And, you know, I'm not sure if you've had this experience, but being called Oreo or, you know, whatever else it might be from people that share the same, you know, racial experience that we do, right? And it almost makes it worse, right? Because we are Black, and when we're in white America, we get treated the same way. But then when we go back to our own culture, we have this treatment as well. So it's very compounding, and I appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, that's exactly how it's always been until I got to college. That's exactly how I've been living my life. That's exactly how it's always been. It's really, I had been struggling with my identity for a really long time. Just my hair and my skin just was a really big part of my insecurities and me when I was growing up. And so it took me until I got here, like got on my own and like met all these different people from different places and different cultures so that I could really accept me for me. So.
Well, you're beautiful the way that you are.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions, thoughts?
As a Japanese American, instead of Oreo, many of us were called bananas because we were yellow on the outside and white on the inside. And it's interesting to consider the issues of race these days, especially because I have biracial sons. And as we've gone through this, I've started to talk to them about how do they identify that my younger son, who's very, very aware of these kinds of things, says, "Dad, I can pass as white." But growing up, he spent a lot of time with his other biracial cousins, which is another thing. So he's sensitive, and I never really thought about it, but it's to navigate the world where maybe you don't feel completely accepted in the Japanese community and you don't feel completely accepted by the white community, that there's some kind of some conflict there that they might have to deal with. But so it's just, I think as future educators, I think that's really something important for all of you to keep your antenna up about, to make sure that everyone feels comfortable and that they understand that they're of value just as everyone else is, because it's tough to not be the normal person out there. It's tough.
But if I could add to that, what I think is important when we're talking about history is to acknowledge all the work that those that came before us have done that let us be here, right? So as a queer person, I wouldn't be this comfortable. Maybe I wouldn't even be out yet if it wasn't for the work that folks that have come before me that have done. Doesn't mean that there's still not a lot of work to do though, right? So I think that it's important to acknowledge, but also looking into the future about how much work there is. And I think it would be a failure on our part if we didn't recognize or acknowledge the harm that this current administration has done to race relations. In a way, Trump has kind of opened it up, right? And he's allowed people to feel comfortable in being racist. And so it's like pulled us back a little bit. And I don't imagine that we're not going to experience this kind of stuff again in the future. But I mean, it's the reality. And I think it's important for you as educators to try to figure out, how do you handle these types of conflicts in the classroom? I have a friend that's a teacher and tried to talk about some racial issues in a more progressive way, and some parents got mad, right? So there's that fear that could be associated with it. And then if they go to the administrator and the administrator is worried about how a parent is going to respond and is not going to back you up, which is probably the right way, I'm sure that's very conflicting in that position. So I think there's an ethical thing there, but I would just encourage you to be brave. And there's going to be people at different levels of positions of power that are going to have the wrong outlook on this. But there's really an opportunity, and I feel like this is kind of part of the reason why this program is here for you all. Is to kind of have that opportunity to kind of reflect and think about how you would handle these types of things before they actually occurred or happened.
I wonder if there's other people who want to comment about being biracial or in different races, and how you balance that, or that feeling of being normal or not normal. And I don't mean that in any way, in a negative way, but I wonder if other people want to add into what Glenn or Tyler have talked about in that respect.
I'll go.
Great, Kat.
Yeah, I did grow up. Looking back on it now that I've gotten older and I've been able to reflect a lot, I have grown up, more privileged than some people of, like Latinx descent and stuff like that. And I have reflected on that. But growing up, it was very confusing for me and hard for me to not realize why I wasn't fitting in with the students around me. Because I was growing up in, a higher middle class family. I went to a school where I was maybe one of 4 people of color, essentially. And I was the only English language learner at my school. So it was very difficult for me to fit in because I wasn't white enough for, all the other students there. So I was kind of outcasted. And then when more students who looked like me started to come in, I wasn't Mexican enough for them. So I found that I was essentially forced to assimilate. And because of the part of the family that I was growing up around, that's the side that I assimilated to, and the fact that that was, the culture that we were constantly taught in school. And I found myself kind of forgetting that side of myself until I got to CSUMB and I was able to take a class and learn about my culture and learn about the importance of it and the importance of what I have to offer to myself. So it was very difficult to come to terms with that, especially because I grew up as, an English language learner. English is technically my second language, but I don't know any Spanish now because I totally blocked that part of myself out.
Mm.
So it's like something that I've grown up to regret now.
Mm. Other people? Okay, so
Oh, sorry.
go for it.
Kat, I just want to respond to you and say, like, I understand. Like, I felt like I had to assimilate as well to what everybody else wanted me to be, or like what I should be, so I could not be like too black or be late, or like if I, it's just I understand. Like it was a lot to go through, but I'm happy that you were able to get a chance to discover who you were and really learn about your culture. And like it's really heartwarming when you get to learn more about yourself and where you come from, and get to be proud of who you are. So I'm happy you got to learn and be at the same place I am right now.
Thanks, Cara.
I think Kat said something really important too about privilege. So I think we've all talked about the areas in our lives that we're discriminated against, but I think it's also important that when we're talking about those, if you will, intersectionalities that we have, that we also identify our privileges, right? So I'm an elected official. I'm in a position of power. It's definitely a place of privilege. I'm a homeowner in Monterey at that, right? There's definitely a place of privilege. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, and I appreciate you sharing that.
Hey, Tyler, when you were talking earlier, you started to talk a little bit about standing up for that intersectionality as a council member and the backlash you got. Could you talk a little bit more about what that backlash was like and what you did in response to it?
I think that a lot of people are, so I'm trying to figure out how to describe it.
But just
Monterey,
go ahead.
No, so Monterey is, if you look at voter data, Monterey is somewhere, I'm generalizing here and I could be off by a couple of numbers, but it's somewhere around 40% Democrat, 30% independent, and 20% Republican, right? So there's not a lot of conservatives on paper in the city of Monterey. We're generally more progressive, and in some ways we are. We talk about environmental issues. They're all about that, right? Which I am too. I get it. I think environmental issues are important. But when it comes to more social related issues, they're a little bit more conservative. And so, but because of the nature of politics on paper, and people knowing that this is a more progressive area, and to the extent that it's very solidly blue, they don't say things to my face necessarily. And they have, some have, but most don't. And so I usually hear things through other people. I'll give you an example. Recently, so Monterey is broken into neighborhood associations. And another side note here, Monterey is about 64% renters, which is actually very opposite of what you would see in a typical community in the United States. Usually a community is mostly homeowners. So that just tells you the inequities in regards to the affordability of housing. There's a whole thing there. But these neighborhood associations are made up of, I would say, purely homeowners. I don't know any renters that are involved with these neighborhood associations. If they are, there's very few of them. And the city historically is very dependent upon these neighborhood associations as representatives of the community. So anyways, there was a neighborhood association president's meeting, and I have somebody on the inside of that group that came back to me later and said that one of the guys in the group said, if Tyler just stops talking during meetings, we could get done faster. And I'm like, First of all, no, I won't go into it. I mean, if you understand the political dynamics of the city, again, knowing that it's a part-time thing, 3 of the council members are retired. There's one other guy who is in the labor force. He's a professor at MPC. So he's happens to be my closest ally too on the council. But I feel comfortable in saying that I do the most work as a council member, and I have a full-time job. So I introduce policies, and I am actively working to make our community a better place. And I feel like some of the other council members are just kind of there to check a box. Like they allow staff to just put whatever is on the agenda. So it's a little bit disheartening to hear somebody, and the things that I'm pushing for tend to be like related to social problems. And so that's kind of the experience, an example of the experience that I get from.
So how do you react to that, and how do you keep moving forward?
That's also a good question. I'm a very personable person. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why I do so well in politics. I get along with pretty much anybody. Like, you could hate me and I'll still like you. And so, but there is limits too, right? And so I will confront you about something, but I'll do it in a way that I try to like bring myself to your level to a certain extent so that you can understand and there could be a takeaway from the experience. That's not everybody's cup of tea, but that's what I try. I don't always do it. I'm telling you, there's so much going on in the city. I wish I had more time to dedicate to all the various topics. I just don't. I don't have time. So like this issue with this guy, and I know who he is. I wish I could approach him and have a conversation about him. But to be honest, out of all the things I got going on, he's not high on my priority list. So I just keep on moving and working with the people in the community that are actively working with me to get things done. So I'm not sure if they answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I think that the last 20 minutes or so here, we all want to focus on how do we teach this stuff in an elementary school, right? You know, how do we touch on race or privilege or gender or sexual orientation, or what should it look like? Because we know it's not in the history books. It's kind of in our state history framework. It's touched on, right? So it's okay to teach it, but nobody really teaches this stuff. And so that's kind of our challenge. And I think maybe I'd like to start with Blanca, who first started talking about ethnic studies at the high school level, but I'm wondering how you carry that ethnic studies ideals and put it in the elementary classroom and what that might look like. So maybe we start with Blanca and then move to Aisha.
Yeah, sure. I think I'll answer that. There was another question about what I would have liked to have seen in the curriculum when I was a student. And I think it'll answer both of these questions. So I think that one way to introduce some of these topics is through giving students an opportunity to have a voice, to share their story and their family stories, because then it's personal and you build community. It's not controversial. Aisha would have been able to share her story, right, about her 2 dads and her different, going from one state to another, right? And if we were talking about, let's say, a unit on immigration, I could have shared my story about my grandfather and the Bracero program, which is not in the history books, right? Nobody talks about it. Or I could have, if I was given a choice, when you talk about the 4th grade missions, there's other perspectives, right? And you can bring in other perspectives through the voice of the children. And so I think when we think about kinder and 1st grade and 2nd and 3rd, so that there's also books that introduce topics. I have a cousin who is gay, and for my son's 3rd birthday, he bought him the book Tango. It's about these penguins, right? And so we started reading that book, and then there's so many books out there. I have like 4 or 5 from when my kids were little. Like, we started having these conversations early on. So I think there's certain books that can be introduced. I think along the way, parents need to be your partners. So I think involving parents is really important. And I'm not saying you need to get their permission. I think they need to know that these topics are going to be talked about. And it's our responsibility to share why this is important. Why is it important for us to share this, right? And I think as the students are a little bit older in upper elementary and middle school, you can start to engage in more of a conversation around it, right? Because I think it goes from like awareness to like their perspectives to like debate, right? To having these, you know, these more kind of conversations. So I think in the upper elementary and middle school, you can have students create norms for the classroom. To build community is super important. I think you also model a discussion with those norms with less controversial topics. So students learn how to have these conversations without getting their feelings hurt or taking it personally, but you have to take baby steps to get to the actual controversial topic, right? And then get feedback from students. How did that discussion go? How did it make you feel? Did you feel heard? Did you feel seen? So that then you can also get feedback from the students. And the other piece that I think is really important is if they're not ready, especially at the upper elementary, I think you can have structured academic controversy topics. And so I don't know if you've talked about this, but it's basically you pick a topic and you say, okay, you two are going to be you're going to agree with this, and you two are going to disagree, regardless of what their position is. But they're going to go and research, and they're going to talk about it, and they're going to come and have a conversation. And then as a team, they come to a consensus about it. So it's not necessarily your point of view yet, right? It's just, yes, so that they can begin to see multiple perspectives, right? So I think those are a couple of ways. There's a couple more, like philosophical chairs, maybe in middle school. I was an AVID teacher, so we did a lot of that. So I think those are some ways from a continuum from awareness all the way to actually debating on a controversial topic.
Great. Isha, got some thoughts there?
Yeah, that I really I loved that book about the penguins. It's probably just one of my absolute favorites. As an adult, I've never felt so seen by a kid's book. And I do think that through kids' books are an easy way to introduce certain concepts. There's a Curious George, it's Ramadan Curious George. And that's one of my favorite things to donate to random kids' libraries around, because I just think it's so cute, and it's a nice way to introduce Ramadan in a way that's really friendly and accessible. But when I was the president of the MSA at the Muslim Student Association at my school, and a lot of different times I've been invited to speak to elementary and middle school kids whose teachers were teaching just about religion. So they would teach them about all religions, and they would try to bring someone in. And I really appreciated that they had invited me, not just because I love to go in and meet their young people, but because people's perception so often of Islam is like a conservative guy, or, even within Islam, sometimes that's our opinion. So it was nice that they also wanted to reflect that diversity of this subgroup. When it comes to Muslims and our representation in scholastic material, I think if you're just presenting about history, giving everybody around the globe at least a positive news story and all of that is really important. Like, find the richest man in Africa was also a Muslim king back in the day, and he probably had more money than Saudi Arabia has now. But did I know about him growing up? I didn't. I didn't know about Muslim Cordoba. Like, Muslims ran Spain for 800 years in this really great coexisting time in history, and it took me forever to learn about those things. So I think sometimes just in teaching a more diverse view of history, it helps us feel seen in things. I think with I love all of the work with the LGBTQ plus history. that Safe Schools Project and different folks have been working on getting the state of California to accept curriculum related to LGBTQ plus folks. That's so important because when I went to speak to schools about religion, about half of the time the teachers had to have like a form signed, and they had to do this and they had to do that just to let their kids hear from me. And I don't, it's nice to hear that California supports talking about LGBTQ plus issues in classes. And I'm encouraged to know that my kids someday would grow up with that.
Glenn, what do you think? Your wife's taught elementary. Ever had that conversation about being seen?
You know, I guess I'd tag along with what Blanca said. I think if you gave a student an assignment to go home and talk to their parents or their grandparents and say, hey, what didn't you learn in history that's an important part of our family history? And that would be a great opportunity for generations to tell their stories, because it's a great opportunity for students to perhaps do an oral report or even teach a class for that day. They could be teacher for the day, because then they could represent their history in the positive light that their parents and grandparents would say. You know, the immigrant communities, you know, my grandparents were immigrants and the struggles they went through and how they managed to navigate to the point where they had a son who was a theologian, a son who was a PhD in chemistry, and a daughter who was a nurse. That happened in my father's family. To be able to, I know that my aunt lived in government housing for a while, but ended up rising up and working hard. And if they could have told that story, if I as a child could have had that discussion with my parents and grandparents, and then I was forced to come back to class and teach for an hour about my family's history, I think that could be a way for us to show that my family's history or my family's experience in a positive light. And it could be a great conversation starter for families.
Yeah. Thanks. Tyler, thoughts from you?
Yeah, just real quick, I think I agree with Glenn. I think Blanca hit it right on the head, so it makes sense given the fact of what she does. But I would just add a few things. I think collaboration is key. So finding that space where you can connect with subject matter experts, folks that are particularly good at interacting with youth, and pulling them in, you know, like it would be like a career day for a specific individual. So, and one example of that might be librarians, right? Like I think you all probably know that more than most folks, but librarians are a source of like beautiful knowledge and wonderfulness. They're such a great resource. And when we talk about the city's budget being disproportionately cut, I think if we create these opportunities for to better utilize our librarians in unique ways, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I also would say social settings, and I think that this is kind of what Blanca was getting to a little bit, right? Like creating exercises so that they can get this kind of hands-on experience. So I think that those were some good examples. And then I think all in that is just this idea of thinking critically. And I don't think anybody's ever too young to start learning how to think critically. So I think that's just a really important element. And again, I go back to Blanca's comments because it's asking those questions in a way that make you think, say out loud how you're thinking and know that you can think. It's just so weird to me in classes these days where people will sit there and don't have any questions. And it's like, what's going on in your mind? Like, aren't things running? And I'm sure things are, but it's just, how do you communicate that? How do you get that out? So.
Great. So I want to open it up to the class members or anybody else who's here. If you want to comment, share a thought, ask a question. I see somebody typing a question on the question document, but I prefer that somebody else in the class ask the question rather than me. So I'm just going to open up the last 10 minutes here to whoever wants to talk or ask questions.
Hey, Rob, while people are thinking of their questions, you can tap into the retired community. There's
a good group. Yeah.
There's a lot of us I'd love to come up to Monterey and talk to some of your students.
Oh, there you
about,
go.
give me, as long as there's a nice golf course somewhere nearby, just let me know.
There you
I'd
go.
be happy to come
There's
by.
plenty of those in Monterey.
Yeah. And I know a place you can get free housing, so.
And some agencies have folks you can bring in if you want, like a panel of folks. The Diversity Center, one of the LGBTQ organizations I volunteer with, they have the Triangle speakers, and they'll send younger folks or folks who speak to younger folks to your agency. There's an interfaith group like that up in the Bay Area that goes to talk about Muslims. Sometimes when it comes to faith, I think it's a thing to be like thoughtful about asking kids to represent their faith, like talk to the parents, talk to other people, just because Muslim kids are under like a lot of stress, and especially femme folks, if we tend to wear hijab and be more visible, there's a lot more stress to like represent everyone. That I hear the kids in my Sunday school class talk about. And when teachers approach their parents and say, will you help so-and-so to make a presentation about Ramadan, or will you bring some treats in? It seems to be a way that's less daunting for kids to feel like they have to represent 1.3 billion people.
I just wanted to give a.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Blanca, then Tyler.
I just wanted to give a resource. Mas Hashimoto is a retired teacher from Watsonville High School, and he was born in Watsonville, and he actually was in a concentration camp in Arizona. And so the students of Watsonville have been very lucky to have been taught by him and also heard his story. But he is a speaker all the time, and he's local. So if any of you want to look him up, I'll put his name in the chat. I'm sure he'd be more than willing to come and speak to your classes.
And I was just going to add another resource. There's the Rainbow Speakers and Friends, which is a queer speakers in Monterey. That's also a great resource.
Who wants to ask the question that somebody was typing?
I'll go ahead and ask, because
Thanks, JL. Show us
I'm
your
the one who
face,
wrote
too.
it.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm just going to read it verbatim because I'm nervous. Okay.
Great.
As I look to the future, one of the most important values that I want to promote in the classroom is respect for everyone, regardless of differences of beliefs, cultural backgrounds, opinions, politics. The list is endless. So looking back, what do you think would have been an effective way to promote this respect in the classroom? So yeah.
So what should teachers do to promote respect in a classroom is what I hear JL asking.
I think one of the things that worked for me when I was a teacher in the classroom was making everybody's voice be heard when it came to what are going to be the norms of the classroom, because and ensuring that every student is able to either agree with the norm that was shared and why, or if they have a norm, to share why it's important to them. Because sometimes what may be disrespectful to someone is not disrespectful to somebody else. And so it's important that that's told, right? Because growing up, when I was in elementary school, the teacher said what the rules were. And I didn't always agree with the rules. I didn't think that some of the things I was getting in trouble for were disrespectful, right? But then on the other hand, sometimes when the teacher did something, I thought that was disrespectful. So why does the teacher get to do that and I don't get to do this, right? And so that way it's a way to build community and respect and honoring the different cultural norms that exist within a classroom, because otherwise there's cultural dissonance when we don't take into account the various cultures within the classroom.
Yeah, so I would say I think that there is like a standard that needs to be created, and I love the model, kind of how Blanca shared. But I also think it's important to recognize that somebody that is racist, right? Like that, there's norms with that that just aren't acceptable because you're mistreating somebody and it's based off of the color of their skin, which is an artificial thing. So I'm not sure how that really fits into your question, but I think it's important just to recognize, how do we get beyond, and I guess I'm more interested in hearing Blanca's thoughts on it, but how do you get beyond those norms that might be inappropriate and that shouldn't be accepted in the classroom in the first place?
I had that happen one time to me, and it was actually more around gender and sexism. And so I had to pull the student aside. We talked about it. I shared that that was not an appropriate norm in the classroom, and that's hurtful, and that we would be talking about it offline, outside. So I did have the conversation with that student. I contacted the family, had the conversation with the family, and that was not going to be something that was going to be tolerated in the classroom.
Can I jump in a second? This is Megan. Rob, thank you so much for doing this for the students and inviting other faculty from CSUMB to be here. It's just a really proud moment for me to see my students getting this experience, and to know that I'm a professor at CSUMB makes me very proud. So just a special note for the teachers to remember that creating that space starts with you. And so that the first thing you need to do is look inside of yourself, and this is a part of that process. Understanding, accepting your identity, investigating your own biases, and learning what it means to become an ally for your students. We walk a fine line, right, in public schools, and I know some of you push back a little bit on some of my kind of safe talk, and how when we're not tenured and we're new teachers in public schools, there's a tension there. And I think there are plenty of ways, and this panel tonight has given us a lot of ideas, but to be an ally and an advocate, and to still, be safe in your work and who you are. And so you'll strike that balance. And I think finding mentors and people you can trust to talk to about your decisions, the things that you're thinking of doing in the classroom, building that relationship with your administrators, that's going to be critical. And we don't want you to reproduce inequities. That's not where we're training you as teachers. We know that you're going to do better and you're going to do different. And I think that this group here is going to be an inspiring future for us. So thanks, Rob, for inviting me. And just remember, the work starts with you as a teacher.
Great, thanks, Megan. Other questions or comments? Go ahead.
I think something I'd like to add is that I think checking your own biases and checking your own implicit bias, I'm on a mission to try and explore those in myself. My son, who's the one in getting a master's in social work, has given me a reading list. And I've actually started a couple of family discussion groups and looking at things like, the book we're reading now is White Fragility. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that book, but I'm not white. But I've got some fragility around some of these things, and it's helping me to explore that, to identify blind spots that I have, and some racist ideas that I have, even as someone who's not white. That these are things that, as teachers, I think you really need to explore yourself, to look inside yourself to see where do you have some blind spots. Do some reading, challenge yourself. Talk to peers who and ask them where they think your blind spots are, so that when you come into the classroom and you have a diverse population in your classroom, that you understand where your personal biases might come in, and they're not intentional, hopefully, but they exist. We all have our personal biases. We all have our own prejudices. We all have our own racist ideas. And once we identify those, then we can be more astute to them, and then be able to be more, I guess, egalitarian in the classroom. So exploring yourselves is really important. I'm 64 years old, and I'm still learning a lot about myself and what I've been socialized to believe. And that's a really important thing.
Great. Any class members, any final comments from any of you before I let the panel members finish this out? Any other comments from anybody who's participating here?
Hi, it's Melissa here. I'll turn my video on.
Go, Melissa.
Before anything, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, sharing a little bit of your past wounds, because that takes a lot of courage, something that I find very hard to do. So I appreciate that very much. And I want to thank all the insight you gave us in regards to teaching about self-identity, because that is something that I wasn't really taught in school, even though I attended schools that were majority Hispanic X, Latino X. But I remember being in second grade and learning about MLK and thinking, oh my God, racism is over. MLK is so great. There isn't any more racism. But the older I got, I realized like the school system lied to me. And I feel as educators, we have this great responsibility to educate our students. I know, like Megan mentioned, we walk a fine line and their standards, this curriculum, but I feel like there's enough wiggle room where students are able to see themselves. And I feel like, I like using it as a metaphor, our students are like trees. The stronger roots they have, the stronger they're able to hold themselves up. And like Glenn mentioned, I thought it was just my family that keeps a lot of our past history in a secret. It's something that, you know, our parents, our grandparents, and we're taught to not question, don't ask questions, don't be rude. And I feel like that's something our students really need. So having assignments where like, go home, talk to your mom, talk to your dad, talk to your uncle, your aunt, whoever you live with, whoever your guardian might be, that brings so much insight to our students' lives, because if they don't ask, no one's ever gonna tell them. So just I'd like to end this with just thanking you very much for joining us. I'm emotional book, so I'll probably just stop now before I get too emotional, but thank you for being here with us today.
Any other participants here? Any final words there? All right, so I'm going to let Isha, then Glenn, then Blanca, and Tyler, you'll be last, just to share any final insights, words, or anything else you'd like to share as a way to finish this out. So Isha, we'll start with you and then go to Glenn, then Blanca, then Tyler.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to mention that I hope that when we teach the history of the US, that we teach the very diverse version. Even among the Muslim community, we don't talk enough about how African-American Muslims really laid the groundwork for us being able to exist in the space that we do today. And I think that when you go to teach your students about the big diverse world, that I hope you do, like Megan said, you look after yourself and you make sure that you're looking out for, you're not pushing boundaries too much, because we need you on the long term. You gotta pick the way that you talk about diverse or maybe contested opinions in a positive way. Please always include, like I said, African-American Muslims in America, or Muslim women leaders, because we have a lot of opinions about Muslims, and I have seen it in literally everyone up to professors. I've never been so disappointed in all my life as when one of my favorite professors asked me if I was gonna drive when I went to do research in Abu Dhabi. And I was like, women drive there, what are you talking about? Women own businesses there. They get to fly fighter jets there, really? So please, among all of the perceptions that we have, that we're looking at, please just make sure that you represent everybody's diversity in whatever ways that you can when you're teaching. I really appreciate you all being here and sharing yourselves too. Thank you so much, Glenn and Blanca. I really appreciate you, and thank you, Tyler.
Thanks, Isha. Glenn, final thoughts from you?
I just think it's great that we have future educators here. And as I've started to look back at American history and the world history, that I think that we need to really look at the history of America in a more objective lens. I think it's been whitewashed. And as I gone through life and visited different places and talked to different people about American history, there are a number of areas where America has made some significant mistakes. The internment of the Japanese American community is just one. Slavery, and we need to bring those things to light to recognize the fact that our history is not pure, nice, and clean, because it's not. But it's all part of how we got to where we are today, and why we still have some problems that exist today, because history has not highlighted some things that were made perhaps unpleasant as part of American history. And I'm hoping that you as teachers can bring that to the forefront, and that those of you who go on to become people who create the curriculum for our future educators, that we can get American history to be more honest and straightforward, so that we can learn from that. Because otherwise, we will repeat what we've done in the past. And I can tell by watching the media and watching people today that people are ignorant of the true history of the United States, and that there's a lot of things that we are not proud of, but by bearing it isn't a good thing. We need to bring it to light. We need to shed light on it so that people understand where we came from in our country, so that we can move forward in a positive way. Good luck to you all.
Thanks, Glenn. Blanca, final words from you.
Yeah, first, I'd just like to thank all the students because we need you. We need more educators. We need people who are really passionate about the work. And I think Professor Megan, I echo what she said in regards to really knowing yourself and learning. And I think it's a journey. We learn as we go along, but the more you question yourself and why you're thinking certain things, the better you'll get to know yourself and really bring up those implicit biases. There's Peter Senge has this framework of the 5 whys. And so when you have an assumption about a student, in this case, ask yourself why 5 times, to try to really get to the root cause of why you're thinking that way. So a student doesn't do their homework ever, and you make an assumption that he doesn't care about his grade. Well, why do you think that? Because he always comes in late, his parents never, call the school. Okay, so is it real? Like, is there something going on at the home maybe, and I'm making this assumption? So there's ways to be reflective, and it's a really good framework to really try to be reflective on the assumptions that we make about our students. And based on my story that I shared, don't believe everything you read in your students' CUMBs. And I would suggest that you do not read them until after you've gotten to know them, because I was already labeled a certain way when I walked into that teacher's classroom because of what my previous teacher had written about me. And so have it be a blank slate. And the last thing I'll say is teaching history can be a lot of fun. One activity I did when I was teaching my high school students, the very first day of class, I did a 1-person skit, and I had each student write down what they observed. After I was done with my skit, I had 7 students read what they saw me do. And there were 7 perspectives. So I told them that history is written by various perspectives, and that in my class, we were going to have the standard textbook, but that I was also going to be bringing in perspectives of women and people of color. And so they understood that what we were reading is not always the fact, because everybody was in the room, everybody saw me doing the same thing, and yet I got 7 different responses. So remember that. Thank you.
Thanks, Blanca. And Tyler, I'll let you finish it out.
Yeah. So I kind of just want to reflect on what Blanca said earlier, but what she also just shared. So I'm going to share something a little bit personal. My partner is Mexican, and he's a teacher in Salinas. He's works at Alisal High School. So we were out one day for dinner or drinks or something with one of his friends who is also from Mexico. They're both from Morelia. And so we were chatting. They're both, they both migrated here. And they were talking, they've been here long enough to where now they can apply for citizenship. So they were talking about how, like what they were checking as far as their race on the application, and they said white. And I was shocked. I mean, and this is from my American perspective of what we see as Hispanics, as Latinos, and I've been to Mexico. Actually, I'm in Mexico now. We're visiting his family. There is their own racism within the Mexican culture itself, right? So, Blanca, you were sharing how you're seen as darker. I see you as more fair skinned. I'll just say that, right? But there is this, I understand that perspective which you come from, right? There's like the Oaxacans, right, that are from the southern part of Mexico that are more native, ancestral, right? They kind of look more indigenous. They're treated differently. You don't see them on commercials in Mexico, right? You see the more fair-skinned Mexicans, right? And so I just say this to the extent that it's important to really understand your students and be careful not to make these prejudgments. And I think it's also important to let your students know that it's okay for them to tell you that you're wrong, right? Like let them know that it's okay for you're here to learn too from them. I think it's really important that you put yourself at the same playing field to a certain extent. Like, right, you're the teacher, right? You're responsible for them, but we're all human beings, and there's that space to learn and grow. My last kind of part here is seriously, thank you all for doing what you're doing. It would be interesting to go around and hear what's inspired you all to choose this as a career field. But this is public service. And just speaking from my experience of teachers within the Monterey Peninsula area, MPUSD specifically, they don't get paid nearly as much as they should be. But I know this is something generally across the board for teachers, right? So you're going into a profession, I'm assuming you're not doing it for the money. You're doing it because there's some level of passion there. And that is to be commended. I mean, seriously, I think that public service doesn't get enough credit. And so thank you for doing that. I imagine that one of you may be teaching one of my kids someday. So I just sending lots of love out there and appreciation. I'm wishing you all the best. I feel so humbled to be on this panel with these folks. After I shared mine and I was going on and on at the beginning, and they all spoke, I'm like, oh my gosh, their stories are so much like, there's so much more pulling at the heartstrings than mine. And I love doing these. So thank you, Rob, for the opportunity of being on with these folks. And I really appreciated this time with you all. So thank you so much.
Great. A round of applause for everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm stopping the recording.